ways this could have gone. There were only one of two ways this was going to end. Either A, after re-adding Crusader Strike to Holy Paladin, Blizzard wasn't going to just leave it laying dead and useless as it is now. They were also going to follow it up with more changes, with the next tuning, maybe next weekend, adding some more functionality to the button, some more interactions in your talent tree, for example. Or option number two, what they did. What they did was, oops, sorry, I guess this was wrong, we are taking back Crusader Strike. Now you don't have it anymore. Again, now it's back only being a button that activates if you are playing with Avenging Crusader. Now there is a debate, of course, that following up on this, you also had some buffs given to Holy Paladin. We haven't actually touched on this when we talked about this. Holy Paladin was on the weak-ish end when it comes to beta performance of healers. When it was about Mythic Plus, they were firmly, very firmly behind both Discipline and Restoration Druid, but also behind Resto Shaman, more or less in the same meh kind of middling level of Mischievous Monk in the beta. They were slightly better when it comes to raid healing. They are still also far behind the best one currently, as it has just been nerfed as well, Discipline Priest, as well as the not nerfed actually Preservation Evoker, but it wasn't that powerful either. Also, much of their power wasn't coming from what just got buffed now for Holy Paladin, because what they got in return was buffing the healing of Holy Shock and also the mana cost of Holy Shock discounted by 20%, as well as Flash of Light. The Flash of Light buff, even though it looks big, 35%, because you weren't essentially doing much with Flash of Light. It had an absolutely pathetic average healing numbers, both in the raid and in Mythic Plus. So even if buffed by 35%, that alone doesn't even amount to a 1% healing increase. Now, the discourse though, the argument, the drama isn't really about this extra set of buffs given to Holy Paladin. Most players don't really care. What had players a little bit shook, perhaps even disgruntled, maybe even seething, raging at what happened, is the fact that all it took was just basically 24 hours, even less, for Blizzard to immediately respond to the reaction of the community, immediately react to the disapproval of the community, and walk back on changes that were not considered good. Now, obviously, after the first few seconds of other players going, nice, Blizzard listened to the players of this spec to do what they wanted. You know, just after a few seconds, as they said this, they suddenly realized they also had tons of things they wanted Blizzard to do for their specs, or to walk back and revert for their spec, which hasn't been done. So obviously what followed this news for Holy Paladin changes was, what about my spec? Why isn't this being done for my spec? What about my problems? As we also have multiple other specs currently having multiple problems in the beta, still not fixed, not even anything in sight, at least for now. So obviously players saw the changes coming to Holy Paladin, whether they were right or not, to make you play with Crusader Strike, put you permanently in melee, or letting you be essentially a caster healer now. The point wasn't even that, it was rather the speed with which Blizzard obliged the player base with their response. So obviously, as you have right now specs like Mischievous Monk, which has more than 40 active known bugs, and things like, for example, a very hard time maintaining their mana when it comes to raid encounters, as we're expecting something to be done about that for quite a few weeks now. That is also not being done. You had other specs with bugs and problems. Some of the rogue hero talents were buggy and they had problems. To be fair, they have fixed a whole bunch just recently, for Outlaw especially, but there have been many specs, from Shadow Priests to Arms Warriors to Blood DK to Feral Druids, whose rework or changes done by Blizzard, maybe because of the pruning coming into Midnight, that they had been complaining about. They had found they had perhaps murdered, they had perhaps limited, simplified, shortened the entire feeling of the spec a bit too much, you know, Elemental Shamans perhaps losing a few too many buttons, leaving their rotation a bit too bare now, for example. None of that has been addressed yet. We haven't really gotten any particular changes for any of these specs. I would be even mentioning Fire Mage, who is actually right now technically the biggest example of a legitimate, no exaggeration, proper, pure and true 3-button spec, but To be fair, Mage already has 2 other specs doing fine, propped and primed to potentially be meta, either in the raid or in Mythic class, so having to complain about Fire also being in a ditch doesn't really feel fair to all of the other classes in much worse problems than Mage right now. And this, has worried players. It's not about you getting angry because your personal, specific, special, main spec isn't being buffed by Blizzard. This is a more macro problem. The idea that some players seem to have is that Blizzard doesn't really know what to do. Otherwise, why would you take away Crusader Strike, try to push Paladin to play more caster style, add more power to your caster version, especially to Holy Light, which now hits like a track, although I'm not sure how would it work to hit like a track on a healing spell, but it does. And then at this point, less than a month away from the release of the expansion, you remove this button without any other changes. So what was the process there? What were they thinking? What was the logic behind doing that? Who is at the reins of these changes? Some players try to minimize this, saying, well, but this is kind of the point of the beta, the point of testing, the point of trying these things out, right? However, this wasn't even tried. Players were complaining beforehand. As soon as they saw the announcement, there was basically no testing done to point out that the change was bad. So it did leave some players to wonder how has the development been going for many of these specs, and makes players more worried about, for example, the specs that have not received significant changes for quite a while at this point. We have received another round of tuning, which we mentioned last time wasn't particularly filled with news, and also most of the news weren't even that good. So players have been wondering about some of the more left behind specs, the ones that haven't received that much attention from Blizzard. Resto Shaman, Elemental Shaman, the 2 DPS warriors, Feral Druid, Balanced Druid, all of the rogue specs, even accounting for the latest set of changes. The recent state also of another spec, pretty rough right now, Devourer, Demon Hunter. Not even talking about the pre-patch where they are missing their Apex Talents effects, which is quite crucial for Collapsing Star, but even when it's at full power, it still has some crushing issues with the entire flow of the rotation. So this was the issue generated by this Revert change from Blizzard. Not really about Crusader Strike itself or Holy Paladin itself. Is more about what does this show us when it comes to the development of all of the other specs in the beta getting close to midnight. This is particularly important, of course, because we're also coming off of a set of pruning. This isn't just your classic go from expansion to the next and get some balance tuning, get some new talents, etc, etc. This is also coming on top of you losing some buttons, losing some spells, a whole lot of proc effects, buffs, etc, etc. So you might have expected even more tuning, because if you took a spec, if you took Mistweaver Monk from this expansion to midnight, and you only had to change some things in a few cases, in previous expansions specs barely even changed at all, so that you weren't even expecting much tuning to begin with, because not much was changing, so you're not really expecting much to be addressed by Blizzard. But then you are in an expansion where you are losing a lot of stuff. You lost a lot of procs or talents or whatnot. Take the mini rework overhaul to Survival Hunter, for example, or all of the changes / kind of removals of Elemental Shaman going from one expansion to the next. You would expect in the following weeks some more attention from Blizzard, some more tuning in the beta, some more testing or changing things in the beta, which hasn't come yet. It hasn't come for quite a lot of specs. And even though I'm sure quite a few players are perfectly happy, might not see anything worrying for themselves, simply because they are observing the results, perhaps even the performances of some of the specs. For example, right now you have Demo Warlock, you have Frost Mage, you have Augmentation Evoker, you have Resto Druid, you have Prot Paladin, Discipline Priest, all these specs doing well. For example, maybe their players won't have anything to complain about, but the rate with which we have been getting changes to specs is slow. And I'm telling you as someone who has kept track, has informed itself, made lists and tracked changes ever since Shadowlands, because you saw those things in my videos. So I know how much in between patches or in between expansions specs are getting changed, and this expansion we are slow. And this is worrying not just because we are slow, so specs might end up not being fully finished, fully complete at the release of the expansion, but also because, as we said, this expansion required, ideally, even more attention in terms of tuning because of all of the things we are losing, all of the extra changes specs are getting from one expansion to the next. So the fact that we still have many specs not getting nearly as much attention. So like right now, for example, Holy Priest is completely stranded and they haven't basically gotten anything in weeks. Same goes for Blood Decay. Blood Decay started the late alpha, early beta OP because Sun Lane was OP. Sun Lane was nerfed down to be as bad as Deathbringer, and since then they've gotten 0 changes. It's been like 2 months now. Not to mention the absolute state of Marksmanship Hunter as well, with the lengthening of the cast of aim shot while removing explosive shot as well. It turned the spec awful. Not really any changes in quite a few weeks that have improved the spec. So basically the point of the video is to doom on the next expansion. At the very least, purely based on observing the amount of changes we have received for these specs. And it's not even about me particularly for my own specs. As said, I'm not particularly affected by these changes. I would be fine playing Preservation or Resto Druid or even Discipline. I don't even think they have gotten that much worse from the War Within anyway, so I wouldn't have any issues with this level of tuning. Instead, it's actually looking at all of the specs in the game so far and the amount of tuning, the amount of changes Blizzard have done, which is not nearly enough for now. Now, luckily, the actual season, the actual competitive side of the expansion will begin like March the 17th, so we have more than a month and a half before then. I guess if you go by one weekly reset, one weekend before the weekend break at the Blizzard offices, you have like 6 different resets worth of possible changes to bring to all specs. So there is time still to add many changes. So this will serve as a reminder / wake-up call / warning sign of the state of the tuning for the specs for now when it comes to the beta of Midnight. And yes, all of this was catalyzed, was propelled by this sudden revert of Crusader Strike by Blizzard for Holy Paladins. We will see in the near future how many more changes we will continue to have and how many of those will be positive rather than the gray area kind of change we have gotten with Holy Paladin for now, hoping that for most specs things will get better. But for today though, on this Saturday, this is what we had to talk about as far as changes were concerned. So we are now going to be leaving each other on this weekend. We're starting our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who have been supporting Competitive for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I did it again. Start a video when you know you're out of drinks, so you have to finish the entire thing with your mouth progressively getting drier and drier because you don't want to take a pause. Oh, damn it.